Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door must take on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess in paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere. Over the past few years, many of the veteran comic book artists and writers who made many of the legendary comics of the 20th century have passed away. And as many of these veteran comic book writers and artists of the 20th century have passed away, there has been a void in the comic book medium as related to teaching. Now, in the last few years, there has been the passing of legendary veteran comic book artists like John Romita Sr., Neal Adams, and George Perez, and legendary comic book creators like Keith Giffen, not to mention the passing of veteran comic book artists like Tom Lyle and Paul Ryan. And with the passing of all of these greats and veterans of the comic book medium, what has happened is there has been a major void in the entire craft of creating comics. Now, this void in the craft of creating comics is one where many young aspiring creators cannot get the hands-on teaching that will help them become better at their craft. Now, the comic book creation process is a trade that is hands-on, but what is really sad about the comic book medium over the last 30 years is that it's become extremely insular, and as it has become extremely insular, what has happened is there are not many opportunities for creators to go out here and apprentice with veteran comic book writers and comic book artists and learn what they need from seasoned veterans. Now, back in the days of creators like Bob Layton, you would work at the side of a creator like a Wally Wood, or in the case of Gil Kane or Steve Ditko, you would work at the side of a legendary comic book creator, and they would go out here and teach you your craft. And this is why guys like Howard Chaykin, who I believe worked at the side of the late Gil Kane, learned to become a master of the craft, because those veteran creators, they would sit there and share their experiences and techniques for creating comics with other creators, and those creators would hone their skills on things like perspective and things like sequencing and transition, and this would help those creators become far better at creating comics than a creator who got no training whatsoever. Unfortunately, the whole teaching process of comics basically ended in the early 90s, and it ended in the early 90s because of the boom in comics. And with the boom in comics, editorial was focused more on sales rather than focusing on craft. And with this lack of focus on craft, what has happened is we got a lot of artists out here who have been learning a lot of things to do wrong, and those things that they've learned to do wrong have turned into bad habits, like what some would say as related to Rob Liefeld's inability to draw feet. And this is all due to the lack of focus on mentoring and craft. Now, mentoring and craft are very important to the medium of comics, and they are very important to the medium of comics because this is how the next generation learns how to tell a story in the medium of comics. You not only learn from just reading comic books, you also learn hands-on, and the best way to learn hands-on is at the side of a veteran who can sit a creator down and explain to them, okay, this is how your perspective is supposed to work. This is how you draw readers in as related to the art. This is how you create a sequence that flows from panel to panel. And the only way you can really learn that is from another experienced creator who has gone out here and had successful runs of comics. But what has happened from the 1990s on is that many of the veterans, what happened to them is that they left places like Marvel to go work at places like Image or CrossGen or many of the other indie companies. And while they were working on these indie characters, the opportunity for younger artists to learn wound up not being there for them. And the reason why the opportunity wasn't there for them is because Marvel's editorial was not really run by a person who was mentored himself like the way Jim Shooter was. Jim Shooter was mentored by DC's editors like Mort Weisinger, and again, learning the craft of the business. So there was nobody there in editorial to focus on craft, and that was shown in the pages of most of the comics of the 90s, which had these extreme compositions, which were misproportioned, perspectives that were just really crazy, and scratchy inked details that really didn't give us a clear picture of the story. And while that kind of art got people excited in the 90s, it really didn't age well 30 years later. And even worse, what has happened is many creators went out here thinking that this type of art was the way to draw comics. And sadly, what happened to a lot of creators is that they picked up a lot of bad habits. And as they picked up those bad habits, they didn't improve to become better storytellers as related to art. And even worse, we had a lot of creators not really learn much about writing. So this is what's happened as related to the void from many of the veterans not being there to give guidance to young talent, because young talent really does need that kind of guidance in order to learn how to improve their craft. And I see this every day when sometimes people come to me on Instagram and Facebook. They will come to me saying that, oh, I'm an artist and I'd like to draw something for you. My rates are good. But when I look at many of their work online, a lot of the compositions of the figures are real stiff. A lot of the perspectives are off, and the facial expressions don't really convey much emotion. And that's because many of these artists were not really mentored in their craft to understand how to tell stories in the medium. And they really haven't gotten that guidance on how to go out here and tell those stories because they haven't really worked with a writer or an artist who can sit down and teach them the craft of comic book storytelling. Because the only way to really improve, as I see it, is by going out here and working with somebody who actually knows something about putting comics together as related to storytelling, and somebody who can go out here and help you work on issues. This is what I've seen as related to many of the indie comics out here, like Isom and a comic that Concrete Comics made called Decimation Earth. I mean, these books really needed the guidance of a seasoned editor to get them to be presented in a way that would make them easier to follow. And because there was nobody there, you had writers and artists making big mistakes on these books. And while these books did make money in the short term, like many of the Image comics did in the 90s, the craft wasn't there. And I believe that the craft could be better if there was somebody there to mentor these creators and help them understand where they were as related to perspectives, as related to shots, as related to setting up your pages, the panels on your page, and working on the sequencing and transitions. These are, again, essential elements if you want to make a compelling comic. And you also have to work on things like your dialogue and your character development. These are things that I'm not seeing people getting trained on. And because I don't see people getting trained on these techniques, sometimes when I buy comics from many of these crowdfunded comics, I see some comics that have serious problems and others I see that could be a little bit better. I mean, there are some great books out there by people who are just starting out, but you always can improve on your craft. That's something I always try to do, whether it be when I'm writing a comic script or I'm writing a novel. Whenever I'm writing anything, I'm always trying to improve and trying to get better because I know that I always try to bring my best to the table and I want to bring my best all the time. So I'm always looking to keep honing my abilities. But when I look at the entire comic book industry, they're not really looking at this whole issue because this is one of the issues of why comics aren't selling. And they're not selling because we've lost so many great creators. And as we've lost many of these great creators, what has happened is all of the wisdom that they have is not being passed on to the next generation. And many in the next generation are not picking up on the techniques that they have learned from many of the veterans and masters, because comics are something that is, again, a hands-on thing, and it's taught from creator to creator, and each creator who learns from another creator, this helps them improve, and also it allows them to pass knowledge on from generation to generation. This is how the craft of comics is taught, and we really need to focus on teaching the next generation what the veterans have learned over the years. I mean, I think about many of the great creators, again, who have passed in years. I think about the passing of great creators that were out here, again, guys like Neal Adams, who was a master of his art form. Again, Neal Adams had his own advertising agency. George Perez, who basically learned comics hands-on. And think about other veteran creators like Tom Lyle and Paul Ryan and Norm Breyfogle. Norm Breyfogle, who basically revolutionized Batman with his unique style. I mean, and even guys like the guy who made the Fathom series, I forget his name, but all of these great creators. And sadly, while people look at their art in trade paperbacks, they were never, their whole techniques are not taught. And what's sad is we don't have any sort of foundation over at modern Marvel or DC Comics or many of the indies to help foster the teaching and the mentoring in the craft of comic book storytelling. And that's something I would love to rectify if I ever were able to start producing SJS Direct comics on the regular. Now, I have been blessed to be able to do comics like Esteem No Good Deed and comics like John Haynes at Death's Door, and I've been blessed to take many of the techniques I have observed from the peripheral of reading blogs like Jim Shooter's blog and reading from many different artists about how to do comics. And I've been blessed to learn from many of these great talents and try to apply many of those techniques to the stories I have written as comic scripts. And one of the things I would love to do as related to building up the SJS Direct comic book imprints publications is to be able to mentor creators in the craft of comics and help young talents be able to develop their skills so that they can go out here and sharpen their talent and come out of a work on an SJS Direct book with more improved skills on their next project. That's one of the things I would love to do if I ever were able to get more momentum on SJS Direct Comics, is go out here and be able to help not only just create comics, but also be able to help sharpen a creator's skills, because the medium of comics needs somebody focused on craft, and we don't see that at Marvel, we don't see that at DC, we don't see that even at many of the indies, and it's really hurting the business because in order to get the sales, people need to see quality on the page, and they need to see creators who are focused on putting quality on the page, because it's the quality of what is on the page that is going to lead to sales long term. And you have to be able to learn how to focus on those things like strong composition, dynamic action, things like good perspective, and really know how to be able to navigate putting dialogue on a page. I mean, these are skills that take time to learn, and I had to learn a lot of this on my own when I was doing John Haynes at Death's Door. I mean, I remember as I was writing the script, I understood that after I wrote the story that certain things weren't going to work because the whole perspective was different, because while I wrote At Death's Door in first-person perspective for the John Haynes series book, the comic needed to be written in third, and it needed to be written in third-person perspective so that the artist could get a perspective of the cameras that's to show us the action. And I also had to learn how to work dialogue to make it dynamic and flow. And I also had to learn how to use things I learned from screenwriting about using the fewest economy of words to be able to tell the most amount of story. And I also had to learn how to compact dialogue. So the comic book version is going to be markedly different from the story version, because in a story version, you can have characters just talking for extended, like 2 or 3 sentence dialogue. But in a comic, you've got the picture, and you don't want a balloon to overwhelm things like I saw with many John Byrne comics back in the day. You really want to watch that because you want the reader's eyes to be focused on the story, and you want the reader's eyes focused on the story because you want the reader to get into the story. Because when you're creating a comic, you have to, as I see it, answer the 3 critical questions screenwriters have to answer. Who is the main character? What do they want? And most importantly, why should we care? And you need to keep people caring, and the way you keep them caring is focused on the action going on, and you keep them focused by going out here and understanding how to use the techniques that you learn as related to the craft of comics. And the only way you can do that is at the side, as I see it in some cases, of a veteran or studying from veterans. I mean, studying from veterans is how you learn technique. That's how I learned a lot of technique, just sitting there reading from guys like Stan Lee's Origins of Marvel Comics and Son of Origins, reading Jim Shooter's blog, reading many comic artists talking about composition, reading about them talking about perspective, reading about them talking about dynamics as related to how characters look. I mean, these are things that a good creator can mentor another creator on so that they can make strong visuals. And this is something that is very important, as I see it, to the entire medium of comics, which has become extremely dysfunctional, with many people focusing on so-called diversity and inclusion, but we're not including anything about teaching craft, and that's really hurting the business, because the reason why comics don't sell anymore is because comics aren't very good, and comics aren't very good because there's nobody teaching the craft of comics. So this is something that I believe is a major issue as related to comics, because as many of the 20th century veterans have been passing away and others have been having health issues, what's happening is that their knowledge isn't being passed on, and that is going to hurt the legacy of comics and the medium of comics. It's going to hurt because all of that wisdom isn't going to be passed to the next generation of aspiring talents, and that's something that really, again, troubles me, and it's something I would like to work towards rectifying. If I could get out here to do more SJS Direct comics, I want to create a place where creators can go out here and learn those talent techniques, learn the craft of comics, and come out of the projects that they work on with better experience and more experience than they came in and learned how to make higher quality comics than when they first started. Now, my first comic that I did with Bill Walko, Esteem No Good Deed, is available on Kindle for 99 cents in digital format, Or if you want to get a paper version, you can pick it up in the Esteem series book, Esteem Blast from the Past, on Amazon.com in paperback on Amazon. And if you want to pick up my first full John Haynes comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, you can find that book on Lulu.com right now. That book was part of a successful 2022 Kickstarter, and I put it on Lulu so that people who weren't able to get it on the Kickstarter can get their own copy on Lulu.com through that service. And I'm hoping to get enough funds together to be able to put together an ISIS comic book and present the first full comic with the Goddess Next Door. And I need your help to do that. So if you guys could drop a donation to the PayPal or the Cash App, that would be greatly appreciated. I've been saving up to do this comic before I can do any crowdfunding because I need to be able to pay the artist to do the work, and I want to make sure that the work is all done before I do any crowdfunding project. So if you guys could go out here and drop a donation on the Cash App or the PayPal, that would help me to get towards the goal of having enough money to pay the artist to do the project. And if you want to try out some of the action-packed fantasy fiction of the SJS Direct universe on the SJS Direct imprint, you can pick up the books of the ISIS series, the Esteem series, the John Haynes series, the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, my vampire novel Eternal Night, or my Black sorority novel The Thetas at Amazon.com and other online booksellers by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available on Lulu. John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at Lulu.com today. Now available in paperback and e-readers, The Temptation of John Haynes. Give in to temptation and pick up this action-packed African-American paranormal romance. Get The Temptation of John Haynes in paperback and e-readers today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.